A cup of instant coffee costs about 7 cents. Not 7 cents for the beans, 7 cents for the entire cup, ready to drink. Meanwhile, a cup of brewed ground coffee runs closer to 37 cents, and your local cafe charges you $4 or $5 for basically the same thing with a logo on the cup. So how is that possible? How does a product that goes through more processing, more steps, and more factory time somehow end up cheaper than the simpler version? The answer involves a specific type of bean most people have never heard of, a financial crisis that crashed the global economy, and a supply chain that was designed from the very beginning to keep costs as low as humanly possible. Let's start with the bean. Because this is where the whole thing falls apart for coffee snobs. There are really only two species of coffee that matter commercially, Arabica and Robusta. Arabica is the one you've heard of. The one your favorite cafe brags about on the chalkboard menu. It's smooth, it's complex, it has those fruity, floral notes that specialty roasters won't shut up about. It also grows at high altitudes, between 1,000 and 2,000 meters above sea level. It needs very specific temperatures, usually between 15 and 24 degrees Celsius. It's vulnerable to pests, diseases, and bad weather. And here's the kicker: it has to be handpicked because the cherries ripen at different times on the same branch. You can't send a machine through an Arabica field. You need actual human hands selecting the ripe ones. Now, Robusta is a completely different animal. It grows at lower altitudes, anywhere from sea level to about 800 meters. It thrives in hotter conditions, up to 30 degrees. It's naturally resistant to most pests because it contains nearly twice the caffeine of Arabica, and caffeine is a natural insect repellent. The cherries ripen more uniformly, which means farmers can strip the branches all at once or even use machines. And Robusta produces significantly higher yields per hectare than Arabica. So to summarize, Arabica is high maintenance, expensive to grow, labor-intensive, and fragile. Robusta is tough, easy to grow, and pumps out way more coffee per acre. Guess which one ends up in your jar of instant coffee? Nearly all of it is Robusta. And because Robusta is so much cheaper to farm, the savings start before the beans even leave the ground. But here's where it gets interesting. The reason instant coffee exists in the first place has nothing to do with convenience. It was born out of an economic disaster. In 1929, the Wall Street crash didn't just devastate American banks. It collapsed global trade, and Brazil, which at the time was the world's dominant coffee producer, suddenly had a massive problem. They were sitting on an enormous surplus of coffee beans with no one to sell them to. Warehouses were overflowing. Prices were cratering. Coffee was literally rotting. So the Brazilian government made a desperate call. They reached out to Nestlé, the Swiss food company, and asked them to figure out a way to preserve all this excess coffee. Turn it into something shelf-stable, something that wouldn't spoil, something that could sit in a warehouse for months or years without losing value. A chemist named Max Morgenthaler took on the challenge. The original idea was a coffee tablet, like a bouillon cube, but for coffee. That didn't work. The flavor was terrible. So Morgenthaler pivoted to a powder. He found that mixing dried coffee extract with carbohydrates preserved the flavor well enough to be drinkable. After 7 years of development, Nescafe launched in 1938. And then World War II happened. Suddenly, millions of soldiers needed quick, portable, shelf-stable caffeine. Nescafe became a staple in American military rations. Troops carried it across Europe and the Pacific. When those soldiers came home, they brought the habit with them. Instant coffee went from a Brazilian surplus solution to one of the most consumed beverages on Earth. Today, roughly 1 out of every 7 cups of coffee consumed worldwide is a Nescafe. The company says 6,100 cups of their instant coffee are consumed every single second. It's sold in 180 countries, and instant coffee overall accounts for about 1/4 to 1/3 of all coffee drunk on the planet. But scale is only part of the cost equation. The manufacturing process itself is engineered for efficiency in a way that most people don't appreciate. There are 2 main ways to turn brewed coffee into instant: spray drying and freeze drying. Spray drying is the cheaper method, and it's how the majority of budget instant coffee gets made. Here's how it works. First, the beans are roasted and ground in massive industrial batches. Then they're brewed using pressurized water heated to around 175 degrees Celsius, much hotter than your home coffee maker. This extracts the maximum amount of soluble material from the grounds. The resulting liquid is then concentrated by evaporation, turning it into a thick, syrupy extract. Then comes the dramatic part. That concentrated extract gets sprayed as a fine mist into a drying chamber where superheated air, reaching temperatures around 538 degrees Celsius, blasts through at roughly 400 miles per hour. The water evaporates almost instantly, and what falls to the bottom of the chamber is a fine coffee powder. The entire process takes seconds. One factory can push through thousands of kilograms of coffee per hour. Freeze drying is the other method, and it produces a better tasting product, which is why premium instant brands use it. The coffee extract is rapidly frozen to around -40 degrees Celsius, broken into granules, and then placed in a vacuum chamber where the ice sublimates directly from solid to gas, leaving behind dry coffee crystals. It's the same principle behind how dry ice works. This preserves more of the original flavor and aroma, but it costs more, takes more time, and requires more expensive equipment. Either way, the result is coffee that weighs almost nothing, takes up minimal space, and lasts practically forever if you keep it dry. And that matters enormously for cost. Think about shipping. A container of whole coffee beans is heavy and bulky. The same amount of instant coffee, in terms of how many cups it produces, weighs a fraction of that and takes up far less space. Fewer trucks, fewer containers, lower freight costs. The packaging is lighter too. You don't need the thick sealed bags that whole beans require to stay fresh. A glass jar or a thin sachet does the job. And then there's the volume game. Nestlé doesn't operate 25 factories around the world for fun. Every step of the instant coffee supply chain, from Robusta farming to industrial roasting to spray drying to packaging, has been optimized over almost a century for maximum output at minimum cost. When you're producing millions of jars a day, the per unit cost drops to almost nothing. But there's a part of this story that doesn't make it onto the label. Coffee farmers, the people who actually grow and harvest these beans, earn between 7 and 10% of the retail price of coffee. Some earn even less. Studies have found that roughly 44% of the world's coffee farmers live in poverty. At least 5.5 million of them survive below the international poverty line of $3.20 a day. And 1/3 of all coffee farmers earn less than $100 per year from their crop. Robusta farmers are particularly vulnerable. Because Robusta is perceived as the cheap bean, the prices paid for it have historically been kept low. Corporations need massive quantities to feed the instant coffee machine, and they have the bargaining power to set those prices. Vietnam, which is the world's largest Robusta producer and a major supplier to the instant coffee industry, has millions of smallholder farmers working plots as small as 1 hectare. So when you ask why instant coffee is so cheap, the honest answer is a chain of compounding advantages. It starts with a bean that's easier and cheaper to grow. It goes through a manufacturing process designed for speed and scale. It ships lighter and takes up less space. It needs less packaging. And it's backed by a century of industrial optimization from some of the largest food companies on the planet. But somewhere in that chain, the people who grow the beans are absorbing a cost that never shows up in the price tag. The next time you boil a kettle and stir a spoonful of instant into a mug, it's worth knowing that the 7 cents you're paying tells one story. The story it doesn't tell is how much that cheapness actually costs. If this changed how you think about your morning cup, the video on screen goes even deeper into how the global coffee supply chain actually works. Click it.